All right. Welcome to episode 1 of the Unqualified Independent Podcast, where we're going to talk politics, but we really aren't qualified to say anything on the subject matter. We're going to be talking about the Don't Say Gay bill, which was just passed in Florida recently here by Governor DeSantis. For those of you that don't know what this bill is about, it talks about um, school curriculum as it relates to gender and sexuality and those kind of things. Puts a lot of restrictions on what schools can teach and other things as it relates to counseling and a lot of different things like that. So we're just gonna kind of take a little bit of a deep dive here and get started. You want to go ahead, Corey?
Yeah, I think when we talk about this bill, there's a couple of things that are really important to think about before you start talking about the impacts, and that's what it's one of the most important things is what the bill actually talks about. So, being titled the Parental Rights in Education, the main focus of this bill is not the LGBTQ community or anything to do with that. A lot of it has to do with a lot of parental influence in the child's education. So there's a lot of this bill that has to do with the schools making sure that the parents are aware and consenting to their child receiving certain services from the school. So that's anything from healthcare, physical healthcare, therapy, anything like that, like a school would normally give to a student. Now it requires parental consent, unless the school deems it as it's going to be something that would lead to abuse, neglect, or abandonment of the child from the parents. So I think when we're talking about the bill, it's really important to understand what it does. Where the name "Don't Say Gay" comes from is a part of this bill where it specifically talks about that from the ages of kindergarten to third grade, classroom discussions is vaguely titled, but it says classroom discussions are essentially not allowed to happen. They are prohibited from happening when it comes to sexuality or gender unless it's age appropriate. So I think it's really important here that we take some time to kind of define a class discussion, because I could say that you and I right now are having a discussion with the listeners,
Right,
with each
right.
other. So I think it's where does that come in a classroom? What is a class discussion? What is that? What do you think that entertains?
I think that would probably. I mean, as far as from my school experiences, a large group discussion that's facilitated by the teacher. Like they are the one that is introducing the subject, and kind of. I think that's more along the lines of what they meant by a classroom discussion is something that was more facilitated by the teacher. Because the bill references curriculum quite a bit, in school curriculum and um, just school protocol in general. It's trying to leave some of these things that can have big impacts on kids. Um, Instead of those being really vague, it kind of setting more set in stone guidelines, which personally I think not a bad idea. It's always good to support kids the best that you can, and the public school system here in America, unfortunately, has a lot of shortcomings. So I think that part of the reason that they're doing this is to, you know, kind of go against that reputation that we have here.
And I think some of it when we talk about class discussions, if we're going to use a definition of a very formal facilitated class discussion, I think it's important to understand that this has to be at an age appropriate time. So this bill is not prohibiting this throughout the school curriculums, all throughout a student's school career. It's specifically from the ages of kindergarten to third grade, where these kids are probably really susceptible to lots of point of views and are really naive. So I think one of the things that this bill really tries to do here is make sure that these students are not even students, yes, but children more importantly, are being aware of what the world is around them, but getting the chance to grow up. Now, I think that there is a large part here that can be said about the education of LGBTQ, um, plus especially as these students get older and into high school. But I think this bill kind of starts the process of getting at the problem here and not starting it too early for these kids. That's in an inappropriate manner.
Yeah, and going along with that, I think it's similar to sex education. Like you don't want to introduce sex education too early because a lot of these kids, they're still trying to wrap their heads around basic math and learning how to read and write. You don't want to introduce these really like complicated, complex kind of societal ideas too early because it confuses a lot of these kids and sometimes that's not a bad thing. Sometimes it helps with some of those critical thinking skills, but also it can. Kids at that age are really, really impulsive, so they want to just make decisions based off of what they learn. It's like you learn that you about space one day in class, and you're like, oh, I want to be an astronaut, and the next day it's like, oh, I want to be a geologist. So I think that there's definitely some value to kind of putting some set in stone guidelines as to like when you can introduce this. And what I don't understand is there's been a lot of pushback for this. Like you said, it doesn't say anything that you cannot teach this by any means. Um, what we see is
Yeah.
there's a lot of pushback. They're just saying like they're eventually going to push it out of schools. Da 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 da. Same thing with sex education. I think you can put it kind of along those lines. Um, you want to introduce it at a certain age, and when they're too young, they're too young. And that's just that. Some are ready earlier than others, but around fourth, fifth grade, that's when a lot of these kids are starting to develop those skills. And I think that it's it's good to outline, like you said, that it does not say that you cannot teach this in schools. It's actually
Yeah.
advocating for it, which is the thing that is a little
I don't know
confusing
if
to me.
it's necessarily advocating for it, but I think one of the major things in this, and some of the pushback comes specifically that a lot of the people who are in opposition to this bill call it an attack on the LGBTQ rights. And I think, while there's some validity to that statement, I think, yes, um, there probably is an attack. I think it's important in this bill to understand that they are limiting this to a certain age group where kids are very naive.
Right.
And I think that it's not about not teaching these kids about what's happening in the world around them. It's like you said, doing it at the right time.
Right.
But one of the other things that this bill has a large pushback, some of the pushback that comes from this bill, um, actually happens with some of the financial stuff that can come into this bill. So there's a lot of stuff in here that gives parents the right to sue schools, to sue the schools for a lot of problems in here. There's some financial impacts of that. It's not necessarily the school that has to pay for it. It is the excuse me. It is the county that has to pay for this. I think I could be wrong, but it's not the school itself. But it is a lot of money that's going to be giving paid because there's an argument here for limitations on the First Amendment right of free speech. Is it something that they are limiting to these kids? Are they taking away the free speech, taking away a teacher's ability to teach this at this age? I don't know if they necessarily are. I think that has to do with a lot, like we talked about earlier, with what is a class discussion. I think that varies from classroom to classroom. Is a class discussion anytime a student asks a teacher and the teacher answers, or is it like you said, a very well facilitated conversation?
Sorry. Um, yeah, and some of the pushback that's coming with this bill too. A lot of the wording in it, from what I've been reading, according to the New York Times at least, it was very vague. And like you said, they now have the ability to sue school districts for, mistreatment or misinformation or things like that, which I don't think is a bad thing, but the the amount of open-endedness that they put in this bill, um, while it's good to not be specific, because you obviously don't want to specifically mention certain issues, I think it also can lead to some downsides, like people taking advantage of the situation, and the fact that the school districts have to pay this. I'm not sure if that's the greatest solution either, since typically that's where most, I mean, schools are criminally underfunded to begin with. So now you're going to have to anticipate potentially lawsuits that are gigantic. I mean, when you're suing somebody, it's typically for a large amount of money, and that's coming right out of the school district's pockets, and that's coming right out of the kids' pockets, essentially. That's impacting them on a day to day basis. So I can see why, I mean, from some more like centrist, nonpartisan groups, why there's a little bit of pushback on this as well.
I want to really get into this limit on First Amendment because I think we've seen this a lot very recently. This kind of First Amendment right, and what does it really entail? I mean, you have places you can't go into a movie theater and shout fire because it's inciting danger. You can't rally a cause for violent reasons. But I think there's a large part of this, and it had to do with presidential campaign spending. Is a really interesting point of this, where the U.S. government has said we can't limit presidential campaign spending because it's a limit on free speech. So I kind of want to get your opinion here, Wyatt. Like, what do you think? Like, do you think that this bill is a limit on free speech in any way, and why do you think there's pushback there?
I mean, to a certain extent, it is. When and I'm an advocate for free speech. I believe it's one of the principles of this country that needs to stay for us to not become a dictatorship or whatever type of authoritarian government. However, I think it goes within when you're talking about, like, for example, libel and slander, right? Those are kind of things that are against free speech because they're harming somebody in some way. And I think what this is doing, in a way, is like we talked about earlier. These kids are naive. They don't necessarily understand everything around the world that's going around, or everything in the world that's going on around them. They're still trying to be kids, and I think part of what this is in my opinion, it's almost like it's saying that this is kind of harmful at that age, and that's kind of why they're looking to limit this in a certain way, right? I think you and I both agreed that at this age they're really susceptible, and sometimes it does a lot more harm than it does good. And obviously, like I said earlier as well, there's going to be exceptions to that, but when you're talking about public schools, they have to do what's good for the general group, and that's why I think that they're kind of implementing this bill. So I would say kind of, to a certain degree, yes, it is limiting free speech, but I think it's doing it in a way so that it's not harming and confusing kids.
I think that's a pretty interesting point of view on this, but I think I kind of want to talk about this idea of like, does it limit the free speech of maybe a transgender teacher or a teacher who is in the LGBTQ community who teaches these kids? If this person is a first grade teacher who is a transgender person and uses a different set of pronouns, whatever it may be, is this bill limiting her ability to? I say her, but obviously
Right, right.
pronouns differ here. But is this bill limiting that person's or that teacher's ability to teach? Do you think something something like that could come about from this bill?
I think it definitely could. There's a good argument with the amount of like open-endedness that it's leaving to like for lawsuits and things like that. I definitely think that at some point, especially with how um, the amount of pushback, especially from the LGBT community, that we've seen in Florida, more than likely it's going to happen pretty quickly here. Um, but I think to a certain extent as well, as a teacher for a public school, my mother's a teacher for a public school, so I have a little bit of insight into this. And you do have a certain curriculum standard that you have to meet every year. Now, as a teacher, you have a certain amount of flexibility with this, right? But you still have to stay within that curriculum. And what it's doing is is making that a part, like, out of the curriculum for the teacher. Now, when it comes to self expression and how you're expressing yourself, it makes it complicated, but I think also in a professional setting, as a teacher, you're expected to be somewhat professional. And part of that is leaving sometimes who you are outside the door and just doing what is best for your employer and for your students at that point. So to a certain degree, everybody has to kind of limit exactly who you are. If I go to work, I'm not going to be swearing up a storm, even if I swear outside of work, because I need to maintain a professional image when I'm at work. And even though that's might be a part of who I am outside of work, I have to leave that outside the door. Um, so curriculum and self-expression, it gets hard within the professional field too. I think it's just muddies up the waters even more.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's definitely especially hard for a teacher because I think some of the most effective teachers who students really bond with, learn from, and really able to engage their students are those who really do express themselves and are very outside of the curriculum that are just the mundane tasks that make students hate math homework,
Right.
right? Doing the simple math equations just over and over again until it's drilled in your brain. I think the teachers that are most successful are those who really express themselves and who they are, but also make sure that the kids are getting who they are. They know who they're being taught by. They know that they can trust that person, especially at that young age. I think that's a point where not a lot of people really realize the impact a teacher has. And I think it's something that should probably be talked about more, especially when it comes to getting their licensure. As a student studying in college for a secondary licensure, I guess we're really not living up to our names of unqualified, as we have a little bit of qualification.
At least
Um,
today.
but yeah, someone who studies this, it's very interesting to see that shift from the elementary education majors that have to take so many classes and so many different subjects to where I, as a secondary licensure teacher, I can teach history as soon as I get my bachelor's in history and a licensure. So I think it's very vital what these students are learning, especially from the ages of kindergarten to third grade. And I think putting a limit on anything they're learning could be the start of a very slippery slope. So when it comes to this bill, I do like that it stays kind of vague in that sense, but it would be really nice to have some definition when we come to that word class discussion, because
Right.
again that varies class to class. So what does that mean, and how does a teacher in a professional stance get this message across at any age, nonetheless kindergarten to third grade?
Right. And see that's where like I said, kind of goes back into that curriculum. Like I said, you said, you want the teachers who are going to go outside of the box and do different things. But I think to a certain degree, as a teacher, you do have to stay within that curriculum to a certain extent, right? You get creative liberties, and that's what makes some teachers better than others, is those that are able to be creative and do those things. Um, but yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes it really hard for teachers especially is there's such a fine line and it changes with every student,
Right.
just simply because students don't learn the same way. One student's an audio learner, the next one's a visual, and the next one's a hands-on.
Right.
And the way our curriculums are set up in America is it's a very standardized curriculum. It's a one size fits all, but it doesn't really fit all. It's like when you go to the store and you get the one size fit all, hat, and it's still too small for your head. Um, so I think these teachers are already faced with incredibly tough situations in the classroom, and then you add on top the societal what's happening in society. I mean, these students are with these teachers for 7, 8 hours a day, and sometimes it's the best 7, 8 hours the students get, depending on what their life is at home. But also, it's 7, 8 hours where they are jammed packed with information. So
Yeah.
these teachers are really riding this line of What do I talk about? What's too far? What's age appropriate? What's professional? What's unprofessional? What's in the curriculum? What's not in the curriculum? So adding stuff like this just makes it really, really hard for teachers. And it'll be interesting to see if the teachers have any pushback on this outside of the LGBTQ community or even whoever pushbacks on this. It'll be really interesting to see if the teachers have anything to say about this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do want to segue a little bit here. Kind of talk. One of the things that's not being brought up by a lot of the mainstream media is it talks a lot in this about counselors and a lot of kind of more structure for what a school counselor is supposed to do. And one of the things that I thought was really beneficial in this bill is it talks about whenever a student needs to get any kind of help, whether that be physical, whether that be emotional, um, any kind of counseling, that they are talking to the parents about that. Unless, of course, it's detrimental to the student in some way, like domestic abuse or neglect or some of those other kinds of things. But I think it's really good in just kind of bridging that gap. A lot of students feel really alienated, and that's why they go to talk to the counselors at school in the first place. I think it's doing a good job in helping to kind of bridge that gap between the students and the parents when there might be some difficulties between them sometimes too.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting there is this is definitely something that goes both ways because I know students. Um, I had friends in high school that would much rather go talk to their counselor or their parents counselor than their parents. But I think one of the interesting things that this brings up, and I read about this a little bit on the Harvard Law page on this, it has a little bit to do with students are coming often to these therapists because they don't want to talk to their parents. So that means that they don't want the counselors telling their parents these things because then they have to talk to their parents about them.
Right.
And it's some of these just kind of divides come up. What is the student going to do? Is something like this where the parent is now legally obligated to inform the parent unless it's obviously going to be abuse, abandonment, or neglect, which I think are three pretty pretty big
Yeah.
things to think a parent would do to a kid. Not something to be taken lightly, but not something to be thrown around for the kid's safety either.
Right.
So I think, is this going to result in less kids going to counseling and then less, generally less mental health, like less, are kids going to be more unhappy in the school? And if they're unhappy in the school, are they learning the same way they are? Are they creating relationships the same way they should be? Can but can teachers do their job effectively? And does this bill have any say if these students are already not listening to the teachers? So I think while bridging the gap between the parent and the student could be really good, I think the way this bill goes at it needs to be looked as a stepping stone and not the end all be all solution.
And I completely agree with that. Your first priority as a school counselor is the mental health of your students, and I think that in some ways this is going to help. Encouraging discussions between families is a lot of how you start to address these issues. So while I think you will see some students who are going to choose not to, um, I think also you are going to see some students who choose to go, and that's going to overall like help mental health. Each individual case is their own, and when it comes to mental health, it's such a personal topic for each and every person. So it's really hard to kind of look at a group and decide what the overall impact is going to be because it's such an individual thing. But I think it is good in some ways in looping in some of these parents on kind of what is going on with their kids. Not all of these parents necessarily know that their kids are struggling with these things too, and I think that's another benefit to this, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of benefits that come from the mental health aspects of this, but I just want to throw this question out to you. This bill also requires that parents, whenever it is at the beginning of the school year, for say, need to consent to all of these healthcare services. So if the beginning of the school, this is a what if question, but what happens if that parent says, no, I don't want my child to receive therapy? And that child now cannot go to his therapist and say, I am really struggling today. I need someone to talk to. I think that just puts a really tough strain on those students. And I want to get your thought on the parents' right to consent to these services.
Right, and it does come down to individual beliefs, and as parents you do get the final say on your children, and that's the way that it's worked here, for a long time now. Now, as if that is to the student's detriment or not, you know, it comes down to that personal decision, and I do think it's uh, good to give people a choice. However, in this situation, I personally would have liked that they did not include that in the bill. I don't really see how that's beneficial in any way to students, um, in any aspect of the manner. Um, I I don't really know what they were going for here, to be 100% honest, and to me, it just seems like more of a negative than a positive. When you're talking about this bill, I think most of the things in here, you have a positive and a negative. This one just seems to have negatives to me.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes in. I mean, when you look at the bill and what they were really trying to get, it's the parental rights in education. So obviously this bill is really going to flow to what does the parent have the ability to say in their kids' education. But I think you're right. I think this parent consenting to these services, I think brings a lot of contradiction in the school. The school hires the best therapists, the school hires the best counselors in order to help their students be successful students and be mentally happy if that's even possible now. But something that where if these parents are always consenting to it, again, this is a what if, but what if you get a school where a majority of the parents don't consent to this service, and now that counselor or that therapist is going to have to be looking elsewhere for work? And what does that do to the students who really needed that counselor? Does their family have to go elsewhere? And now do they have to pay for that service elsewhere? Can that family afford that service elsewhere? So I think obviously that's a very slippery slope argument. I'm depending on a lot of things to happen in a certain order for that argument. But something that you have to kind of just look at all of these what all of these parents get as a say and say, is this something that needs to remain as the parents say, or is this something that we need to start shifting to the student and the child and letting them have a little bit of say over their own life before they're 18?
Absolutely. And when it comes to mental health, like we've talked about earlier, it's such a personal thing that I think you have to protect the students here. I think that's the best course of action. However, not everybody sees it that way. Obviously, it was popular enough to get through Florida's House, Florida's Congress, and lost my words there. And but I, like you said, I really don't understand how this is really beneficial to the students in any way. I think it's going to do more detriment than anything. It's good to give the parents, like, cue them in some way, and that's why I like the communication when it comes to school counselors. But the fact that you're able to completely opt your kid out of it, um, those kind of services, is a little bit ridiculous to me. I think that also kind of ties back into when we're talking about physical health, immunizations as well. And I think that, for the general public's health, when it comes to things like polio and some of those other diseases that we have these vaccines developed for, they should not be able to opt out of those things to attend a public school.
And I think you obviously have your people who are always going to be anti-vax. I think it's a huge thing right now with the COVID vaccines. But I think you have a pretty strong point there. At what point we have to kind of keep our limitations here to keep some public safety? So I think that's a really good point. But I want to kind of shift back here. One of the representatives in this district, her name's Val Demings. I believe she's a Democratic. I could be incorrect, but believe that. I cannot find her official
Party designation.
party. Correct, but I'm pretty sure it's Democratic. One of the things she said under this bill is that it's a bill of censorship and fear. And I think that's a really interesting take, and I want to know what you think about that.
I don't think that this is really censorship. Like we talked about earlier, I think what this is it's a limitation on free speech, to a certain degree, but to make sure that it's not detrimental to the people that is affecting. Um, and what I find really, really interesting about this bill is when you look at traditional stances when it comes to politics. Republicans are typically pro free speech, and Democrats typically tend to be a little bit against that. Um, not in all cases, but on in this particular bill, you actually see that flip, and you have the Republicans that are in Florida that are supporting what these Democrats are calling censorship, which is, it's really interesting. It comes back to that individual personal definition of what is the freedom of speech, right? Um, most of the things that we talk about here in this country tie back into that, and you know, I don't. I think calling it censorship is a little bit extreme. Obviously, as a politician, you do have to make statements that are going to, you know, garner support for yourself, and I understand that to a certain extent, but I don't know if I would call it censorship by any means.
Yeah, I think it's. I like how you said this bill is kind of flips the script, and I completely agree with that. I think it's really interesting that the way that this is going about is kind of flipped how the parties are kind of representing themselves. I mean, obviously the Democratic Party is still standing up for the LGBTQ rights, but it's really interesting that with all of this parental consent, that we don't see more support for it, or maybe not support, but more amendments really trying to get at this LGBTQ part of it. I think parental rights and education, as the bill's titled, is something that's kind of, I would call it a pretty bipartisan issue that gets addressed in this nation. But on this censorship and fear, again, from the representative Val Demings from Florida's Congress district, just to read the rest of the quote here, she says, "When did we become so afraid of each other? In the greatest nation on earth, we should not be afraid of our neighbors and our differences. As a former social worker and police detective, I investigated crimes against children." And I think what she says next is really interesting. She goes, "I choose to continue to stand up for all children. My message is this: leave our kids alone." And I think that's kind of more profound than it sounds like. And the reason I brought this up in specific is a lot of the representatives have commented about this bill. It's highly controversial. But the reason I bring this one up in specific is I think she has a really interesting point here about leaving the kids alone and just letting them grow up in the world they grow up in. And I think that's a pretty profound statement, but I think again, I think there is a point where you can put too much on the kids too early.
And I find that really interesting that she's saying, let the kids just be kids, essentially. And I think that in a certain way, that's what this bill is trying to accomplish. It's trying to let kids be kids and not have to deal with these complex political and social issues that we're seeing in today's America. I think that's what a lot of this bill is trying to accomplish. And I feel like it's almost somewhat of a contradictory statement in that way. It's saying like, you got to let the kids be kids, but also you can teach them whatever you want. And the adults have to be adults too in this situation. That's what a lot of this bill is. It's not it is focused on the kids, but it's focused on a lot on the adults too, as parents, as mentors, and as supervisors for these kids, that they need to let them be kids. You know, and
I
that's what
think
a lot of this bill comes back to when we talk about parents and counselors and teachers and curriculum and all those things.
I think what's interesting here is this whole kind of idea of you see it now with a lot of parents, a lot of parents that super shelter their kids, and then a lot of parents that really, I don't want to say don't care for their kids, but let them live and take risks. And there's a lot of talk about, is there a right way to raise your kid? And if so, what does that look like? And I think one of the things that this Representative Demings is trying to get at here is let your kids learn it for themselves, whether that be through a teacher who is transgender or does consider herself as lesbian, whatever it might be, or a gay teacher, whatever it might be. Let these kids learn from that teacher, someone they should theoretically be able to trust. But I like what you said about this being a contradictory statement and kind of voiding these kids from certain things to let them be kids, to learn how to climb a tree or to learn how to, when their dad takes their son out to catch ball or when their mom teaches them how to paint nails, whatever it may be. You can go to the most stereotypical examples like I gave you, or something like this, just any child just playing dolls with their sibling, whatever it may be. Just this whole like, let our kids see and experience and win. And do we really have any type of way of controlling this? And I think that's probably the biggest question of, in this world of immense social media and kids getting electronics, phones, tablets in the hospital room after they were born. Essentially, I didn't get anything till 8th grade, and it
Oh
was
yeah.
because I
Oh yeah.
begged and pleaded with my
Right.
mother. But in this world of just immense technology, can you really protect your kids from something like this?
And it goes, being living in the age of information too. Like that's one of the many downsides to a lot of this technological process that we're seeing. But going off what you said, I don't think it's a bad thing, in some ways, to let someone who is a trusted individual teach these kids about that. Because if you have a gay teacher or a lesbian teacher, I think it's good to, kind of introduce those subjects, and it humanizes it in a way. When you see it over the internet, that's what a lot of this is that lack of emotional connection. So there is some benefit out of that. However, I think when you're trying to introduce politics to kids and, these some of these things that are a little bit more complicated, when it comes to especially gays or lesbians, I think it's a little easier to explain that to a kid. Oh, I don't like girls, I like boys, right? They can kind of wrap their head around that. It's really those the complexities of like uh the genders and transgenderism and some of those things that I think that those are a little harder to introduce to into the classroom at this age. And we have to remember these kids aren't even 10 yet. By the time you're out of the third grade, you're turning 10. So that's the other thing too, is these kids are very very young. So it is good to not confuse them in a way, and not introduce really complex. That's a lot to try to explain. I am a man, but I identify as a woman. I don't completely understand that as an adult, and you're gonna try and explain that to somebody who's 8, 7, 6.
I think it's such an odd thing, and I like what you said about this humanizing and this emotional aspect to it. I think kids especially really rely on emotion. They don't have social skills to know anything else, especially at that age. I mean, when you were in 3rd grade, if your friend said I don't like you anymore, I mean, it was, your world just ended at that
Right.
point. So I
Right.
think that's a very good point of view here to say, like, it's an emotional connection to these kids, but I think there's a point where it can be too much to a kid. I think some of it, I don't want to say it's easy to explain to a kid because it's far more complicated than simply, oh yeah, I'm not into girls, I'm into guys. I'm not into guys, I'm into girls. I think that's a pretty big simplification, but I think it's a good one for these kids. It's like you don't teach kids multiplication before you teach them addition.
Right.
But I have a really weird um, reference for you. Bert Kreischer is a comedian who has a Netflix show, where I forget the name of the show, but essentially he goes to this cabin and he invites a bunch of people up, and weird episodes. It's really not for the faint of heart. Definitely wouldn't watch it with your mom. But one of the guests he has on there is Caitlyn Jenner,
Right.
who is obviously probably one of the most well-known transgender people there is. And she asks a question at the end of the episode that I think is a really interesting question. Can't remember who the other guests were, but they ask her a question. She responds with, "I'm going to ask you a question that you've probably never heard before, and I'm going to ask you this, and we're going to see if you can answer. But when did you know you were a boy?"
And see, yeah, it does tie a lot back into that question. I mean, personally, I don't know if I have a specific answer for that. It's just kind of something that was always a part of myself, and you know,
Right. So how do you explain this to a kid that's kindergarten to third grade and not just overwhelm their brain? And I think that's what this bill. I think that's the intention of this bill. Whether it comes through the right way in this bill can be talked about, and whether they should have amended it differently before passing it. But just I think that's the intent of this bill.
right, and I completely agree with that. You're not putting these complex ideas for society. But one of the things that is really important about this bill, like we've touched on multiple times, is it doesn't say that you cannot teach this at any point. It is just saying for these younger children, you know, that you are trying to avoid putting these complex and somewhat confusing thoughts into their heads and confusing them more than anything. I think that's what the root of kind of all of this is, and
Yeah.
to a certain degree, I don't understand a lot of the pushback. I understand educating for anyone is a good thing. Chase, turn that back on.
Where'd you go? Hey, you're back.
And sorry about that. My brother turned off the light. Um, you know, education is always a good thing, but you need to do. It's like you said, you can't teach multiplication before you teach them addition, and you can't teach somebody that you know I'm a boy, like I was born a boy, but I'm really a girl before you teach them addition either. You know, it's
Right.
it's a lot of critical thought and things that go into this, and that's what the root of all of this is.
Yeah, and it comes back to what we first talked about. What's a classroom discussion? When you read the bill, it specifically says prohibiting classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in certain grade levels or in a specified manner. And that's such a vague sentence, and it never really gets defined in the bill. So, again, does that mean if a student in class one day raises their hands and says, Miss Teacher or Mr. Teacher, I have two dads. What does that mean? Yeah,
Right.
does this mean that the teacher can't sit there and say, "Well, that means that your dad is gay," and is that limiting this teacher, or does that teacher have to say, "I don't know, ask one of your dads"?
See, and I think that goes back into kind of involving the parents in all of this. They're allowing the parents to introduce those topics at certain points when they're wanting to. I think it is good to learn things from your parents sometimes. But going back to that topic of classroom discussions, I think what this is it's more of on an individual basis. You're able to. I don't think that it's saying that you cannot address those things whatsoever, but it's saying more of in a group orientation. So it could be, oh, you have this question, I have two dads, what does this mean? You're not addressing that in front of the entire classroom where it might not apply to each of the students, but instead implying it in more of an individual manner. And it might be, oh, okay, like you want to know more, let's go out into the hall, have a little talk, and we'll make sure that you're able to wrap your head around this kind of a thing. And what that does is it allows clarity for the individual situation, but doesn't confuse those in the group who can't relate to that.
And I think, especially for these students, like you said earlier, this super emotional connection. That child that has two dads or two moms, or a dad that used to be a girl and a mom that used to be a guy, whatever it may be, that's all they've known. To them, that is the normal. So to a student with two dads, don't think it'd be too far to assume that he thinks that that student assumes everyone has two dads. So I think it works both ways. You don't want to confuse the student with two dads, but you don't also want to confuse the students that have a dad and a mom or two moms, and that's all they know because that's all their emotional connection's been with.
Oh yeah, and absolutely, I agree with that. And and that's why it's able, I think it's good to be able to kind of deal with this on an individual basis. You can explain to them, oh, well, you have two dads. Not everybody has two dads. Somebody might have two moms. Somebody might have a dad and a mom. You know, but in all reality, you know, realistically you don't need to be explaining anything further than that, and it's up to the parents to kind of disclose that information about their relationship to their kids as well. And I think that's ties back into, like you said, the title of this bill. It's all about the parents, getting the parents involved in everything, right? Parents should be involved in their kids' lives, and that includes, kind of addressing and or maybe introducing some of these complex topics, before the school does, and able to do that on an individual basis rather than in a group setting.
Yeah, and I think something that I don't remember how old I was, but my parents told me about it, and they were the first to tell me about it. And I know I was in middle school. It was probably sixth or seventh grade, maybe even fifth grade. But I was kind of old enough to understand when they told me that, okay, you're telling me that gay people exist who like other men. I don't do that. And I was at a point where I was like, okay, cool. Like, I just kind of went on with my life. Like, good for them. And I think there's a point in a student's life or a child's life where there's a really key time to tell them that, and I think that same point there's also a key time to not tell them that. But I think that's very individual to the students. For me, I grew up with a dad and a mom. I identify as straight. So does my sister. We're a very traditional family. And I think students who grow up with two dads are living a not so traditional life compared to society. So I think, is that a student that kind of needs to start understanding this a little bit sooner than a student with a mom and a dad? And I think those are some of the questions that this bill starts to bring to light, but I definitely doesn't think answers any of them.
Oh no, and I completely agree with that. It is all down to the individual basis, but it's like you said, I think, fourth, fifth, sixth, bleeding into middle school there. That's kind of when your brain is starting to look at the world around you and develop both that self identity and the identity of those around you. And that's part of what this bill, I think, does is it says, okay, right, we get through the third grade. Now we think that you're ready to kind of be looking around and seeing those things, and oh great, we can have that conversation if somebody's bringing it up in my fourth grade class, or maybe nobody brings it up until eighth grade. It allows that flexibility still, but it's just prior to that. um, and obviously there is going to be individual cases. Everybody is ready at their own time, but I think it's a rather good line as to when you can start introducing this. Now, you could make an argument a little bit younger. Personally, I think, like I said earlier, they're turning 10 by the time they're going into the fourth grade. That's kind of when you're ready to start to figure out some of these more complex things. But I think it is really important to have that line, and that's what this bill is doing.
Yeah, and I think some of it's also important that I think there is a point where it's too late to tell students about this. I think once you come around middle school and these students start to hit puberty and they start to have to answer a lot of questions about themselves. what's happening with my body? Why am I feeling the way that I am? I think some of these students are kind of struggling with this question. Am I a boy? Am I a girl? Do I like boys? Do I like girls? Do I what do I like? And I think if the student doesn't have any education on that, I don't want to say by that time, but just no awareness of it, I think they're likely to make decisions or assumptions about themselves that maybe aren't truly what they really want, but they just don't know what they want yet. So is there a sweet spot that teaching these kids about this and allowing these discussions to happen that just is a one size fit all, or is the one size fit all solution just not going to work here?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're talking about public schools in general, because this is all directed at public schools. This is not private schools. You know, they all private schools retain the ability to choose their own curriculum and what they teach. But what this is doing is it is using that one size fits all, in my opinion, you know, and it's saying that this is the best course of action. And obviously, it's the public school system, and we're in America, which is a very, very diverse place. There's not going to be a one size fits all answer for everything, but you do have to do something that is beneficial for your majority to a certain point. And you know, the LGBTQ community is still a minority in America. It is, you know, it's only about 1% of the population or so. So you do you will have those individual cases, but it is good to introduce things that are going to be good for your general group. And I do think that this does not it does not prevent having conversations or introducing these topics at school. What it is it's just determining age appropriateness, and um and the term age appropriate also isn't the best in my opinion, because that's saying like, oh well, this, you know, there's an appropriate age to decide when you're doing this. There's not, but uh, I think it's good to just, like I said, to have some kind of line. You need to have some kind of standard. You know, we don't want to be telling 4-year-olds this kind of stuff and have them running around making decisions that they might regret for the rest of their life, or, you know, becoming forming the self identity that is not truly who they are, and just confusing them in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that I think a lot of this bill is probably going to end up being trial and error. I think it has kind of at the end that it gets reviewed. The Department of Education reviews and updates this as necessary. So it's not something that once this bill's put in place, these are the set in stone rules that are going to happen. So I think some of these things that are going to be worked out, I think it would think and would hope that would be kind of around this age appropriateness, class discussion, parental consent, some of these things. You know, will it work? I don't know. We may never know. But I think there's a lot of this bill that kind of is going to be left to trial and error. And I think it provides a really good jumping off point for this conversation that we're having and for these conversations to take place and kind of understand that if we can come to a certain point where we say, yes, we want these kids to be learning, but how? And what does this side want and what does this side need? Kind of conversations that just haven't happened in American politics since forever, essentially, since the U.S. became a nation and the
Right.
compromises were such a huge thing. So I think this bill is a fantastic jumping off point, but I think there's a lot about this bill that is probably unpolished as of right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's always like um the ability to amend it or repeal it, or however, if you know, if they are doing studies, you know, but we do there is the ability to reverse it, and that's something that I it is important to keep in mind. So a little bit of a segue here. Florida high school students have been staging walkouts in recently due to this bill. Um, and I have a quote here, and I would like to see if I could get your opinion on it, Corey. So it says, being an LGBTQ student in Florida is already incredibly difficult due to bullying from fellow students and peers. This is from Miami high school student. I can't pronounce this name, I'll be honest.
Throw it up
I'm
on the
pretty
screen.
sure it's
Throw it up on the
Javier
screen.
Gomez, said Thursday. This legislation will compound this problem and make life even more difficult for LGBTQ students. So, what I want to get your opinion, similar to the quote that you had earlier, do you think that this is going to be detrimental to LGBTQ students?
I think I think I understand the argument where a lot of these people are coming from, saying that this is an attack on those people's rights because we're not teaching the children about it. And at that point, the children who don't know anything about it, who think it's weird or abnormal to be that way, grow up to be the bullies. And I think that's a really justifiable argument. And I don't like, but I like the part about he said that it's already hard enough in Florida. I think is Florida is a place that is well documented. It's a very Republican state, and Republicans are very traditional in the way that they approach these things. A lot of it comes from their religious views of marriage and sex and trying to reproduce. But I think what's important here is that this bill is unpolished is the word I'm going to use here. So I what I enjoy hearing about that quote is that these high school students are taking a say in this. I really like that the young generations are. I say young. I graduated high school last year, but that the my generation is starting to speak out about things like this that really could be detrimental. Now, do I think this bill is detrimental to LGBTQ? Can't say yes, but I also can't say no. I think I understand that they're saying that these kids need to kind of have a basis of understanding, but it's what we've talked about this whole episode. When is too early, and what is age appropriate, and how do we define that? So I think, yes, I think Javier Gomez, I think is the name you said,
Yeah,
think he is very correct in saying that this bill is going to make life tougher, but I think there's also room for this bill to figure that out and specify we are not trying to take away the teaching of this, but just make sure it's at the right time.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I think that'll wrap it up. Thanks for watching, and hopefully this will be up on TikTok and YouTube here in a little bit. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Peace out.
Stay unqualified.
Stay unqualified.